Friends, Brian here from Middle Age Mind and Muscle, and I'm just sitting here doing some video editing. And here's another view of the office. Of course, you can't see with this camera. The life of a YouTuber, right? It's just crazy. Let me film it here. Let me film it here with this camera on my phone so you can see. It is a winter wonderland here, folks. See? See? And Christmas is just around the corner. I hope everything is going well for all of you guys and gals. And hey, if you've enjoyed my part 1 of my chat with Chad Venters, PhD, Ultimate Warrior Biographer, here's part 2. Now remember, hit like, subscribe, share, all that other bullshit that gets annoying to listen to on YouTube, but it means a lot. I appreciate you taking a second, burning half a calorie, and making that click. All right, enjoy, and we'll see you soon. This is my therapy. So the Warrior is left again. He was suspended, and he's out for a couple of years. And then in '96, he comes back again. He makes his return. Again, I apologize if I forget the WrestleMania numbers. I'm old. I've had too many concussions. All I know is that I got to hit the gym tomorrow. Got to get my pump back on. But against Hunter Hearst Helmsley, which is well known in that match, he kicks out of his finish. He looked great too. A little bit more streamlined too, but he still looked great during his tenure with the WWE then. And we get into now talking about he was bumping heads with them again because I believe it was him and Linda McMahon were taking care of the business between each other. And there were some issues about some of the toys or something they copied. I don't know. He went to a trade show that he wasn't invited to, and he saw they were using his themes and his things that they were supposed to be his. What's your recollection of that his exit in '96? He wasn't showing up to matches because he said there was unresolved issues, so he just stayed home until they got fixed. But they were trying to promote that he just was unreliable.
Yeah, in '96 is when it all hit the fan. So in '96, but he had earlier, a couple of years earlier, he had changed his name to Warrior legally. And later on he would talk about the Warrior philosophy and all of his stuff. But he did admit at times here and there that part of the motivation for that name change was so that he could wrestle as the Warrior, given his tenuous relationship with the WWE.
And I believe that there's a wrestler named Ryback who left the WWE on a year or two ago, and he's done the same thing. Apparently, he's changed his name as well.
Yeah, because it comes to the question, can you stop someone from using their name?
Yeah.
Now, of course, you get into the trademark stuff. But '96 is when it all comes crashing down. Because in '96, after he gets fired again, and as the WWE says, he's not making his appearances. Hellwig says he's not making his appearances, but there's a business reason behind it. They fire him, and that's the year he launches the lawsuit against WWE. The famous lawsuit that lasted for 4 years and, chewed through his finances, became the bitter, vile boil under his skin for all of those years. And so that's when it all hit. And so he had this lawsuit about he wanted complete and full rights to Ultimate Warrior. And of course, WWE wasn't having that because WWE says, well, now hold on a second. You were Dingo Warrior when you arrived. We invested a lot of money, a lot of time into promoting your character, and it was even our idea to come up with your name, Ultimate Warrior. So that's when the lawsuit starts. 2 years into it, the court ruled in Arizona that Hellwig did have the full rights to use both Warrior and Dingo Warrior because those preceded his time with the WWE. Now in '98, WWE files another lawsuit, this one in Connecticut, and kind of an intelligent strategy. Hellwig had launched a trademark suit in Arizona. So WWE doubled up his workload and fees with his lawyers by launching a separate suit about copyright, because copyright and trademark are different things legally. So they had this 4-year saga of going back and forth. And eventually what happens is they come to terms on a settlement. And part of that settlement is a cash payout that Hellwig gets, it was, the numbers are right, 900,000 according to the court documents, and then another 90,000 that went into an escrow account that Hellwig was allowed to draw from after X number of months, provided he didn't disparage the WWE. So this lawsuit basically kicks off what was the great war between Hellwig and WWE that lasted pretty much up until the time that he came back for the Hall of Fame.
So in the meantime, he did some speech. He was hired. He did some talking at university campuses in the States.
Yeah.
I don't think we really need to get into some of that stuff. Some of the stuff he was saying and all that. It's just.
Yeah.
But now 2008, he made a return to the ring over in Spain. I forget the name of the federation, but he wrestled Orlando.
Jordan.
Yeah. So, now it's very interesting because, like in the training videos, you got to remember this guy's almost 50 years old and he looks awesome.
Yeah, he did.
I don't know how much he weighed. He was probably, I would guess, he was probably in the neighborhood of 230. You got to remember, like, as you age, like he got a lot of flack for it. And when he was in the ring, he obviously, in later years, he definitely had some problems with his knee or his leg or his hip or something. Because with the way he was, and even when he was walking out to the ring, then you could see like something was going on. But a lot of people weren't happy with how he looked for that match. Myself personally, at least in the training videos, I'm like, holy shit! I hope I look like that when I'm 49. Holy God, he was lean and ripped, and he just. But anyway, he had the match against Orlando Jordan, and controversy around that match. He tried to he kind of expanded, did a bit more moves and stuff in that one, but there was a general sense that maybe a lot of the fans were kind of let down by how he looked. But you got to remember, this is a 49-year-old guy. He's not 25 anymore. But and I often get a kick here at the House of Gains. I've done really well with my recoveries. Like I did some personal bests with squatting yesterday, and I've only been able to really squat properly for 5 or 6 weeks because I had fractured my foot badly in a match last year. Right. And but usually, like, it does get harder as you get older. So when I have guys, young lads, saying, "Hey, just suck it up," if I talk about like a tweak or a twinge, it's like, we give it 15 or 20 years. But I thought he looked quite good. But even still, there was a sense when he was in the ring, it was like, he looked okay. But that's just the nature of the beast, right? So, so he had that match, and then from there, he was very active on his website. And you could tell he was very pissed off.
Oh yeah. In fact, I have some of his basically reconciliation with the WWE. A lot of the stuff that was out there about him prior to that has vanished from the internet. And that includes his Machete blog.
Yeah, I remember that.
The famous speech that he gave that you were referring to from the University of Connecticut. That thing has been expunged. They've really worked hard to try to eliminate all of this stuff. Fortunately, I made a lot of copies of things, and I'm pretty sure I wrote about the Connecticut speech. But given you're Canadian, I was looking through his writings today, and I had one that I came across that I thought you would appreciate because he's writing about Canada.
Oh, I remember that one too.
Yeah, so
he really put the country down.
And keep in mind, of course, folks, as I'm reading this is Jim Hellwig's words, not mine. But he says, most of you, not all, furiously responded, defending your country as if I was insinuating all of Canada as a country were faggots instead of some individuals. This was never in my mind at the time I used the word, but now that you bring it up in the way you have, in the aggressive, finger-poking, in-the-chest, challenging manner in which you have, I have to admit that I should have let my opinion of your country influence my thoughts a little bit more. It surely will now as I write a response to you. And he goes on to talk about, he talks about how, you as a country, you're inferior to the United States. Some of you evidently have been chewing on too much moose jerky or something, and comparing Canada to America in any way is a stretch I frankly think only sissy boys would try to make. The United States of America is the leader of the free world, and it will always be. America is the standard setter for all great and inspiring things worldwide. Our problem is not, as America haters, Canada included, will insist, that we pound our chest too much. Our problem is that our own leaders don't do it enough. So some of that, and he goes on more. He also didn't think fondly of your contribution to the war on terror, just to let you know. So there you go, Canada. That's your daily dose of warriors.
Yeah, it's funny. An old friend of mine, he was in the American military. Oh God, years ago we were talking about, because Canada had been involved in Afghanistan and fighting. They had special forces over there, and I think just recently there was a member of the Canadian special. He killed, like, it was from 3 miles or something, a sniper. It was just in the news a few weeks ago. It was a Canadian special forces guy killed an ISIS guy from 3 miles away. He set the sniping world. So it's kind of, I always got a kick out of it, because my friend who's in the American military, he said, I didn't even know Canada was in Afghanistan. I did 2 tours there, but Canada does have a little bit more involvement than people might realize. But no, I found that was very interesting. But I do want to touch on this topic, and it is controversial, and but this whole thing about Jim Hellwig and homosexuality, because as you know, the language that he referred to in that post, also his University of Connecticut speech, where he says that the queering doesn't make the world work. He got into, there is a big uproar about that. In his defense, he was trying to say, what I meant to say is that if everyone had homosexual sex, we couldn't reproduce as a species. But I think...
Which is a stupid argument to make anyway. But yeah, that is what he was saying.
Well, now, Chad, you choose to answer this if you want, but I do recall on your website, Hellwig's reason for getting out of competitive bodybuilding, or getting out of competitive bodybuilding and the bodybuilding scene in California, or was it the competitive bodybuilding or the competitive bodybuilding scene, competitive bodybuilding or the bodybuilding scene in California? I distinctly remember reading in your research that his friend said that Jim Hellwig felt that, why did he want to get out of competitive bodybuilding?
Well, according to his friend that he talked to, and realizing, of course, that Hellwig, in his 20s, maybe a little chip on his shoulder, he basically said to his friend that if you're not a fag, you can't win in bodybuilding. That was his perception of the industry. It was engineered by fags and run by fags and so forth. And this is I actually talked to Ed Connors about this, and Ed didn't think that was something beyond what Jim would have said, or whatnot. And he said he may have had some kind of an incident when he was in bodybuilding that had led him down that. He didn't know for sure. And of course there were rumors in the early 90s, and even prior to that, there was always the rumor mill running, that he had even been involved in maybe some kind of as being like a gigolo to other men, sexual favors, those sorts of things.
In wrestling lore, if you listen to, I mean, not that I take the Iron Sheik very seriously, but there is a lot of talk that there's something in bodybuilding called gay for pay. And I mean, I was always very naive. Like, I never saw any of that growing up. And I trained in the city I grew up in. Like, I mean, I was 14, 15, 16 working out at the hardcore gym with all the steroid freaks. I never saw any of that. I never heard any of that. Nobody ever came on to me. Nobody bothered me. I was always very heterosexual. I mean, I only started hearing of this stuff in recent years. And as I said, I have a friend, the same one I was telling you about, who had the incident at the border. He gets hit on and offered money all the time online for a guy. And he's just like, well, I don't get it, but it's a very common thing. And the bodybuilding lifestyle, it can be very expensive. So when you look at the drugs, the supplements, the food, the tanning, because it's a very, it can be a very self-indulgent lifestyle. And for some people, they go that route to make their bills, to pay. So is it possible that he did that back then? Now, I heard an interview with Sherry Tyree for a wrestling program. A guy had a radio show. It's online. It's all on the internet somewhere.
Yep.
And she makes reference to this, but I can't tell. It's at the end of the interview where the interview sounds like it's serious, but then in the end it clearly turns into a work. So I can't tell if she's serious or not. But that she had heard something about that. But that was, so I just find that if that's true, I find that so hypocritical for him to say those things. But I'm leaning towards that it probably isn't true that he did that. He did gay for pay for him to be so outright. That's some serious skeletons in the closet to be putting down other people, I think.
Oh yeah. Well, and in kind of thinking about, as I've pursued this story to some extent, and I've never been able to come up with anything really credible that talks about it. There was the tabloid article that talked about it. I think it's just as possible that because of his very, angry, and pejorative comments that he makes about, gay people, that can also perhaps lend to rumors getting started. Because, again, even pulling from his website, I highlighted this passage because, again, it just kind of strikes you as the kind of person he is. Same thing with queers. It doesn't make me a homophobe because I find homosexuality abnormal, parentheses queer. It is abnormal. And I have the freedom to make my own moral choice that I believe it is, just as a queer has the freedom to make his own immoral choice to be one if he wants. And so he definitely had a hard chip on his shoulder about gay people. And wherever that comes from, whatever inspired that level of venom in him, I don't know for sure, and we could probably analyze it psychologically all day, but he certainly, in his later years in life, put up his flag about what he thought about gay people.
Well, I think for him to be that way, if he was in fact involved with gay for pay when he was younger, I just can't see that connection because I think most guys that would have been involved in that when they were younger would just shut up and not say those things. Because God forbid if that came out, if that came out, he'd look like the biggest hypocrite. So, but I mean, who knows? But that's something that it's controversial. But I wanted to discuss about that. But the next thing I want to talk with you about is again having a little bit of a just my time in wrestling was just a very minor, but this whole thing I've always had a feeling like when you're a wrestler, you're doing a job. You're doing what your promoter tells you to do. So if you go in and the promoter says, look, I want your match. This is kind of how I want the match to be, how I want it to end. This is what I want you to emphasize. These are the points I want you to get across to the audience. You do what the promoter says. So, I mean, if I was working in wrestling and I had to do a job for somebody, I would just be like, well, this is what the promoter wants. I'm going to do the best I can to the best of my ability. I wouldn't sit around and bitch and complain. I would probably take the stance of what do I need to do to make my character better, to appeal more to the fans, and what I think that was kind of what Hellwig did. But I wanted to talk about, because you had interviewed some other wrestlers, including the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. I honestly think there's an element of jealousy for his skyrocket to succeed, whether they would admit it or not. And I understand if you're a generational wrestler, if you spent your whole life in the business, to see somebody else shoot by you, but you're doing a job. It's a job. It's like, I don't think Ted DiBiase did bad for himself during...
Not at all.
But, I mean, him and Hellwig clearly had issues.
Yes. And he was very honest about that, to say that they had really what I would consider to be a personality conflict with one another. And it went both ways. I mean, Hellwig spared no effort at all to also take shots at DiBiase. So there was no real love lost between the two of them. But, there was that sense, and you kind of heard it on Self-Destruction from several wrestlers, that Jim Hellwig was, and I think it's fair to say, kind of limited in the ring. He was limited in the things he could do. And that was part of, I think, what seems to have bothered at least his contemporaries, was that he never made an effort to advance his ring skills. They all seem to praise him for his physique. They all talk about, man, what he did with his body was phenomenal. And most of us never could do that. But his ring ability was really lacking. and he never tried to make it better. And that was seems to be one of the main gripes that his contemporaries had about his performance. And I think probably what you might call the jealousy factor. Watching Vince shoot him to the top. I mean, he had an extremely meteoric rise.
Yep.
He comes in late '87, and he's champion by '90, pins Hogan. You're seeing that, why is this guy getting promoted when he is really, really limited in what he can do?
Well, again, and the counter argument to that, I mean, Hellwig himself would say, yeah, he was, but he did what he needed to do to make himself appeal to the audience and to make it work. So I can understand from a working wrestling perspective, if I had to work with this guy and he was really laying the clotheslines in and hurting me, and I had to call all the matches because he couldn't call anything in the ring. And, of course that would bother me a little bit, but I'd also look at, well, why is he so successful and what do I need to do to be successful? So, I mean, I think sometimes, and maybe this is a more type A personality trait, you don't have time to be jealous. You say, what do I need to do to succeed? While other people sit around and bitch and complain. Other people probably just knew their place in the company or were happy just to have a job. But, like for example, Bret Hart, if you look back, sometimes the Warrior had good memories of his time around Bret Hart. He really cared about his brother Owen. They were friends. But Bret Hart really never had anything good to say about the Warrior. But it's like, well, Bret Hart did well for himself too in a different way. But it's just hard for me to, and I'm trying to think as a professional wrestler too, but it's hard for me to think that, there wasn't an element of jealousy. Jealousy exists. It's like a cancer amongst human beings, right? It's, if we could eliminate jealousy from the planet would be a lot better place to live. But, so I wanted to know from you, again, what you thought. I think that there was an element of jealousy.
Sure, and I think that it's probably a variety of factors. When you're looking at these various strands, and that's what I'm doing, is I'm taking all of these interviews, whether the ones I've conducted or others, books and so forth, and you read them, and it's like you say with Bret Hart. Bret Hart hammered Warrior in his book, hammered it.
I have his book.
And then, of course, after post-death, he talks about, I wish I'd been nicer and so forth. You see a common thread with a lot of these guys, which is that a lot of them, whether it's out of jealousy, out of the time, whatever it was, a lot of them did not take kindly, and I think it's probably a combination of things, take kindly to the lack of in-ring ability and what probably most of them perceived as the ego that then came with it. Because that seems to me to be one of the key factors in all of this. When all of a sudden now, Warrior wants to hold Vince up for money. Warrior wants to make demands. Warrior wants to do this or that or this or that. That's where I think a lot of this really starts to come into play, where these guys look at all of this stuff taking place. And you see a pretty common narrative pre-WWE Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Where these guys have no problem saying, look, this dude had issues. A lot of guys, some of them will just say, hey, the man got paid. They approach it different ways. But there seems to be a general consensus that his lack of in-ring ability and perhaps the ego that accompanied it, particularly with what he did to Vince at SummerSlam, really set a lot of his contemporaries off.
Well, a big thing amongst the boys too is they have a thing. It's like a code, loving the business. Do you love the business? Well, the Warrior looked at it as a job, and he looked at it as a way to make money. But isn't that how anyone would look at a job?
Right.
So, I mean, I understand that and the whole brotherhood of the professional wrestling thing. Like, do you have a love of the business? Do you have a love of the business? Well, I don't think you hear different things about the Warrior, but I mean, I think he didn't mind the business because he got paid. But he looked at it as a job. It wasn't like, I want to be here forever until I'm 65 wrestling. I'd like to make... And, it's interesting because when he was still Dingo Warrior, they had an introducing some new star thing. I think it was for Wrestling World or something. In '86, there was a little blurb about the Dingo Warrior. But and then they said, what do you want? And he said, I want to become very rich and make a lot of money and then retire and disappear where nobody can bother me.
So when I said earlier that wrestling magazines, a lot of it's a work, but then you have little splatterings of truth. I mean, clearly that was Jim Hellwig saying that.
Yeah,
because that's what he went on to do.
Yeah, and it's all part of the enigma that is Jim Hellwig. And this is really what inspired me to start writing about him and researching him, because he really is such a complex figure. It's kind of like I talked to you about before. There's something interesting about the guy who, when he took the WWE to court over the self-destruction DVD for disparaging him and so forth. Well, when you read the lawsuit, it's very clear he doesn't have much of a case, because as the WWE very accurately points out, this dude has been disparaging us for years. And they cited all these examples from speeches, from the Flynn files, all of these times where Jim Hellwig had said, some very degrading things about Vince McMahon or the company and so forth. But you think about the kind of personality it takes to spend, years hammering a company in speeches, on your website, any chance you get, and then they release a DVD and go, well, how dare they? I'm going to sue them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reflects the complex personality where he at times was very loving and loved his fans, and at the same time would just rant and rave against the business. In his shoot interview, he hammered Bret Hart for hugging Vince after all of that stuff. And then what do we see in 2014? The picture of Warrior hugging Vince.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There's all of these different threads that come together, and probably a combination of things. Whether it be the financial piece, which I think does play a factor, because based on what I've read in documents, in the legal documents, Hellwig made a good chunk of change while he was in the WWE, but he burned a substantial amount of money fighting the WWE as well.
What was his? What would you say? From the research I've seen, I think his top. What was his top earning year? Was it about $1.5 million or?
That's roughly the number I've seen as well. And I actually, just recently got a hold of some more legal documents that I now have to sift through to kind of look at his salary and so forth. But yeah, he made pretty good money, but he had land holdings. He had a gym at one point down in Arizona that failed. And Ed brought that up. Ed was kind of hurt that Jim wouldn't ask him for help. He was like, why wouldn't you ask me? I'm one of the architects that took Gold's Gym National. Why wouldn't you ask me for help in helping your gym succeed? Because Ed said I could have told him when he launched it, the market that he was hitting for his gym was not the right market. And, even stuff like with the comic book. He had the comic book run, and I've got, all the comic books here, I've got them all.
Yeah, and you do a real good analysis on them. It's you do a really good analysis. It's brutal.
It is. Well, and I happen to also be a huge comic book nerd, and I love comic books. And you read through it, and you're just looking at this, and you're going, wow, this is a really bad comic book. This is where he really needed a professional writer to come in and do his story, which wasn't a bad story in principle. But again, Jim Hellwig asking for help seems to be a common thread that pops up over and over. He really could have used some help from professionals who could have done some things for him. You get a few business ventures that failed, and then by the time you get to after the WWE lawsuit, I don't even know how many people are familiar with this. It's on the site as well, but he launched a lawsuit against the law firm that represented him in his lawsuit against the WWE to try to recuperate fees, because he spent in the 4-year battle with WWE over $1 million just in fees trying to fight Vince McMahon. And by doing so, he burned up so much cash that it became known to him that he may not be able to recover the lost sums of money in this lawsuit because of how much he had burned. And so, you know, he spent so much money fighting the WWE that it put them in a precarious financial situation at that time. And best I know, they didn't ever recover from that. Like they weren't swimming in cash whenever he went back for the WWE Hall of Fame.
No.
It was a battle that took a toll on his whole family.
Well, have you do you keep in touch with his widow's channel?
I don't. I've gone on there a couple times just to see what they did with the format post Hall of Fame, because I was kind of curious. Are they going to leave up, you know, him calling Vince a scumbag and, you know, and Triple H, you know, all this, that, and so forth? And of course, surprise, surprise, that's all gone. But no, I haven't been watching. I've seen some of the stuff, but I don't go on and watch the videos all the time.
Well, recently she had Dana Warrior. She has a couple of interesting videos up. A week or two ago, she put up one. It was a tour of his home gym in a barn. And it was kind of cool. But the one thing I would say to Dana, and Dana, I like your videos, but I'm just saying, you just got to turn the camera sideways to get a better field of view in the video. Yeah. But it was kind of neat. She goes through and she shows his home gym and stuff. But she did put one up the other day. It was showing through their house. It was a Pueblo type, you know, house in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But I'm kind of under the impression that it's up for sale, or they're selling, or they're moving. So
could be. Yeah.
I've wondered financially, like, kind of. Well, I mean, let's be honest. Like, I mean, what relationships over the years has Jim Hellwig still maintained?
Oh, yeah, not many.
Like, if you look at shoot interviews and stuff, like, the people that say good things about him are very few. Gary Hart hates Sting for some reason, but he really liked Jim Hellwig. He said he was a wonderful guy, even at his best. When he was really popular, he always made an effort at airports to come over and say hi and everything. But a lot of people, like, just in shoot interviews, like, not a lot of people have nice things to say about him.
No, yeah. Which, you know, and that's part of also what inspires me to write, is because Jim Hellwig is a human being like all of us, which means that he's not an archetype of good or evil. Yeah. And people want to portray him in one or the other, you know, as appalling as I think his views were against, say, gay people.
Yeah, I agree.
That's not the whole story of who he is. You know, he had his serious issues, but he also had his positive points as well. That's part of what makes him an intriguing figure, is when we take apart the fact that Jim Hellwig is not the Ultimate Warrior. Jim Hellwig played a character called the Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah.
Yeah, the man Jim Hellwig has nothing to do with his in-ring stuff. And I think that a lot of times wrestling fans get that mixed up. You know, I remember just the other day being involved in a conversation on Twitter with some guys who were bickering about this. And one guy brought up the anti-gay warrior stuff. And the other guy responds by saying, "Dude, you must be a Hogan fan." Which I thought, that is a really bizarre thing to say. What would being a Hogan fan have to do with Jim Hellwig the person? But of course, that's the problem, is intertwining the fictitious character with the human being. And that's really what my work is about. I'm not diving into the Ultimate Warrior. I'm diving into the man who played the Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah,
to me, that's what's fascinating to me, is not the character who ran around and shook ropes, the man who portrayed him.
Now, we should probably take a few minutes and talk about his stint with WCW.
Mm-hmm.
So we know
that's all it needs, too, just a few minutes.
Yeah. We know that he got a phone call from Hulk Hogan, and he was talking with Bischoff, and they offered him a really large contract to come in and work. During that time, so he had the famous intro where he got in the ring and had the speech, and they said that he was 15 minutes too long, and they were like, all the television people were trying to get him to go off the mic and cut it and everything. Yeah. But I mean, there's a lot going on with WCW at the time. They said that, like, the whole climate had changed, the demographics of the fans had changed. Like, the NWO angle was New World Order. It was really popular at the time.
Yep.
The Warrior, he really had that, and I apologize, what's that called? Was it a dust, what's those things? Those jackets. those jackets that he wore to the ring.
Oh, like the duster? Yeah,
Duster, that's what it's called.
Yeah, the duster. Yeah.
Well, he was still in good shape. He wasn't quite in the shape he was in, when he was in his mid to late 20s and the WWE heyday. But soon after, in that War Games, he had a match against the Big Show. I guess he was called the Giant at the time, and he tore his bicep. But he didn't really take much time off, and he had remarked about how a lot of guys would have silly injuries and they'd take months off and still get a paycheck mailed to them, but he wanted to earn his money.
Yeah.
But it just wasn't kind of working. They had the One Warrior Nation gimmick and him with Brutus Beefcake. And it just wasn't flying. And Warrior's on record on his shoot interview saying, like he was getting airplane tickets to be at events that he wasn't even told to come and work on, sent to him. It was so disorganized. It was chaotic, and Bischoff wouldn't return his calls, and he's like, well, I mean, they paid me a lot of money to sit at home.
Yep.
But he was willing to work. And there's some other wrestlers recently I heard that were on record saying, no, he was wanting to work. He was there's a lot of guys, it was known during WCW, were really, doing what they could to not work but make the money, get the checks sent to them. So, but anyway, his time with WCW was fairly unremarkable, and then it climaxed with that really horrible Halloween Havoc rematch with him and Hogan, which was just an utter disaster by all standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's about the WCW is whether or not you go the route of, where Warrior thinks that he was brought in just to soothe Hogan's ego, as Bischoff said it, and to lose a match, which if it was, that'd be kind of bizarre. But I think that there is something to be said about the Ultimate Warrior character in that environment. And actually, one of these days when I get a chance to sit down and write the whole book, one of the things I'd like to pursue in it is a chapter about Stone Cold and the end of the Ultimate Warrior. Not because the two were ever in the ring, but because the idea of how when you introduce a character like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who changes the dynamic of good guy versus bad guy. Steve Austin is an anti-hero. He's he's a guy who's flipping people off, and people love it. And he's an ass kicker and all these things. How does a character like the Ultimate Warrior, which is this super heroic, altruistic figure, operate in a world where a Steve Austin is as big as he is?
Absolutely.
And I think that may well have been part of the problem. Is I'm not sure the Ultimate Warrior character can operate in that kind of an environment. The character itself is inherently linked to concepts of classic good versus evil wrestling. And that's not what happened. That's it changed dramatically in the 90s. And with that, the environment for the Ultimate Warrior itself changes dramatically.
Absolutely. So so after WCW, we know he did his little rematch in 2008 over in Spain. And now leading up to the reconciliation, which, I think a lot of us were shocked when we heard that he was going to be at the Hall of Fame. It was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my understanding is that it was Hunter Hearst Helmsley that really, Triple H was the one that really took the initiative. But also, as you mentioned earlier, Vince McMahon putting personal feelings aside, I think it is clear that he did have some type of attachment to Jim Hellwig, but he's also thinking, what's best for business for us to sell out this Hall of Fame?
Absolutely. That's, everything I've ever read about Vince McMahon. And by the way, there's Vince McMahon, like Jim Hellwig, like most of these guys, there is plenty of negative that goes along with their stories. And Vince McMahon has no shortage of that either. Some of the working conditions, things he does to his employees and so forth. But at the same time, what everyone seems to agree on is he's a damn good businessman.
Yeah.
And Vince McMahon's willingness in the 2014, as far as I know, wasn't the first time he had tried to get Hellwig back into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vince McMahon isn't going to be the guy who just lets personal feelings exclude a big payday.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the reasons why when I continue to go back to the whole SummerSlam hold-up thing, there's not a doubt in my mind that Jim Hellwig did exactly what the WWE said he did, because there is no way I can reconcile Vince McMahon telling his number 2 talent, "You're out," for no reason whatsoever.
No, absolutely. So now we talked about this at length in the past, but so he comes out, he does a speech,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's out the next night to Raw. He comes to the ring.
Yeah.
I won't speculate some things I'd seen on social media and Facebook. His family members had said, out of respect for the Hellwigs and stuff, regarding his health. In the end of that one documentary, he says that he's looking forward to the future. He signed some kind of ambassador deal. But I think, to me, and it's only my somewhat educated opinion about the Ultimate Warrior, the way that man walked to that ring and the way he looked and the way he walked out to the speech, he was sick. There's no. I mean, some other people were, on record saying that he looked frail and he looked very. So we know that when he died, I believe he was 54, but his grandfather died at 52 and his dad died at 57. All of the same thing. They had a coronary, they had a heart attack, but they had heart disease. It was genetic. He is on record at the Zahorian trial saying that about his grandfather passing, that genetically he knew he only had. If people look back on in the trial, he talked about he was aware that he was on limited time. He wasn't going to live. He did state somewhere that he was pretty sure his time would come in his 50s. So you see this a lot after he passed away. People are like, well, did he realize, was he sick or whatever? Now, his wife is on record saying that somewhere I thought I saw a video of her saying no, but I don't want to kind of involve things that I've seen on Facebook and social media with some of his other family members, but how anyone could not look at that man who always kept himself working out and in shape and had a pristine diet. We know that genetics do play an event. You can do things that will help you, but when your genetics decide to turn off, they turn off. But it is hard for me to comprehend anybody watching that man at that speech and the next day at Raw and not think there's something wrong with him. He is not well.
No, I
couldn't think that.
Completely agree with that. It looks he looked to me like he was really struggling during the Raw speech, especially. Like he was hurting up there. And so when he falls dead the next day, and again, Vince Russo pointed out, and I think it's fair that, maybe the fact that he died just after is causing all of us to reinterpret this through those eyes. But no, I'm fairly convinced that he either knew he was ill, which I would imagine he did, or unless he just doesn't go to doctors and he had completely ignored any doctor's visits, they had to have some notion that he wasn't doing well, which of course leads, at least in my mind, to the possibility that one of the reasons he did choose to reconcile with the WWE was because he knew he was on borrowed time.
Yeah, I definitely think there's more going on to that. As I said, out of respect for his family, I don't want to repeat things that were said by other family members concerning his health that I'd seen on social media and Facebook. But to me, how anyone could think that he was fine, there has to be, it's incomprehensible to me. That man clearly was not well.
Oh yeah, and and again, it's this, like I said, there's what I'm saying here is my guesswork. It's just a hypothesis. And nothing that I have documented, like a medical chart that shows this or that or so forth. But my guess would be that for all those years when he talked about he would never go back, he would never have anything to do with McMahon again, so on and so forth.
Never say never.
Yeah, go ahead.
I said never say never.
Exactly. Then all of a sudden he's back. They're hugging. He's the single greatest wrestler who ever came into the WWF. You're looking at it. You're watching the Self-Destruction DVD. Then you're looking at what they're saying about him in 2014, and you're thinking to yourself, did everyone just have like a midlife crisis at some point here? Because the narrative radically changed. But that's kind of what the WWE does. They tend to change narratives based on what's going on at the time. And My guess would be that he was not well. He probably knew he wasn't well, and perhaps to better set up his own family for the future.
I think so.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that at all.
No.
He chose to finally, and I think kind of endearingly, lay aside some of his hurt and his pain, some of the things that in some respects he brought on himself, and in others things that were brought on him, maybe out of jealousy or spite or so forth, and chose to go ahead and do what he needed to do, which, frankly speaking, yeah, Jim Hellwig belongs in the WWF Hall of Fame.
Absolutely he does. Absolutely.
Yeah. Ultimate Warrior, as limited as he may have been in the character, whatever else, was a great character. Phenomenal character. Hellwig orchestrated that character with just a precision and beauty that made him, even to someone like me, who I still have these wonderfully fond memories of the Ultimate Warrior from when I was a kid. And while I try not to let those things influence my writing, I recognize that there is this wonderful character that he orchestrated, and that whether or not one likes or dislikes the man Jim Hellwig, boy, did he have a cool character that lasted a very long time in the hearts and minds of people who were watching wrestling.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting contrast if you want to look even deeper with Vince McMahon is clearly a type A personality.
Sure.
He clearly is an alpha male. He clearly is the boss.
Yeah.
And he clearly likes for everyone to know that. So it's an interesting, because in that type of scenario, who's going to challenge Vince McMahon? So when you have someone like Jim Hellwig, who he himself is a very powerful personality, type A, alpha, likes to make his own choices, sees things his way, and he's going to tell you how it is.
Yeah.
It's an interesting contrast. Maybe we can do this another time, talking about Vince McMahon and Jim Hellwig. But the Ultimate Warrior affected a lot of people, and even in bodybuilding, he was one of the reasons I really got into working out. And through my teenage years, building up the self-esteem, trying to look better for the opposite sex, the whole thing. He played a massive role to me. I had a friend of mine. My family, we were always behind the times. We didn't even have a VCR, but my friend did, and he would tape the late night wrestling shows, and then I'd go to his place, and I just watch his matches over and over. I'd be like, dude, that dude's so jacked. It'd drive my friend crazy. But it's a very interesting story, but ultimately, no pun intended. The way I look at it with Jim Hellwig is he was motivated from his upbringing, I think. I think Ted DiBiase kind of mentioned that a little bit too. He said, well, I understand the source of his drive now because of what happened with his father. But he became successful, and but he did it in a very tough business. Like the bodybuilding industry, even then, was a tough business too to make it anywhere in. But I would say that the wrestling business was even tougher. And he to make it in the wrestling business, whether it was in the 80s, the 90s, or today, it's a tough. I can't convey that enough. So like, when I have young lads that come up to me and said, "Oh, you've done some wrestling," I'm like, "Yep," and they're like, "Well, I want to get into it and this and that." I always say, "Hey, man, go to a good school, get hooked up with a good instructor." Like I give them all. I did a video about that on the House of Gains a little while ago. I'll put the link up here. But like Jim Hellwig says in his speech that he got to pretend to be a tough guy, but really anyone who is a professional wrestler and can get through that is a tough guy. Like
absolutely.
So, but Chad, it's always a pleasure, and hopefully, our video series here on the channel will get a good response, and I'd like to have you back on again to do a follow-up video. But anything you'd like to, and I can't encourage people enough to contact Chad. I'm going to get all his details to have all his social media and the website info up here for everyone to check out, because in another way too, I was upset. I mean, I'm not the most emotional person. I'm the cocky jerk. But I actually did cry when I heard that Jim Hellwig passed away. It really affected me very much. And your website was actually kind of soothing, because it was just something to read and reflect. And so it was, I always really appreciated it. I thought, man, I hope this guy, I'm not a WordPress guy, I'm an HTML guy, but I can appreciate all that went into that. And I just thought, man, I hope people are appreciating his the work that's gone into this. My God, it's just such a treasure. So I hope that people will take the time to check it out and get in touch with you and follow you on Twitter. We'll hope to have you back on soon.